14 minutes. That's all it took to rewrite the rules of Western diplomacy. Not a war, not a sanctions package, not a missile test. A phone call, 14 minutes, and then silence. The kind of silence that spreads through foreign ministries before anyone says a word out loud. The media will tell you this was a trade dispute that got heated. They'll show you graphs of tariff rates and quote unnamed aides on both sides. But here's what no one is saying. What collapsed on that call wasn't a negotiation. It was the last remaining fiction that the most powerful country on earth was still capable of governing itself under pressure. One man came to that call with data, a structured proposal, and patience. The other came with posture. And when posture met data, it shattered. Here's the question you should be asking yourself. If the leader of the free world can't finish a phone call with his closest ally, what exactly do you think happens when the call is with Beijing? Let's start with the number that changes everything. $420 billion. That's the estimated cumulative cost to the American economy from the trade confrontation with Canada. Disrupted supply chains, lost production, collapsed export markets, higher consumer prices, vanishing manufacturing jobs. Not to Canada, to the United States. That figure came not from Canadian officials or opposition politicians, but from a private briefing delivered to the White House Chief of Staff by the National Association of Manufacturers. That means American industry, the very constituency the administration claimed to be protecting, went to the White House and said, "You are destroying us." Not them, us. The second implication runs deeper. That number means Canada didn't blink. Canada absorbed the pressure, diversified its trade relationships, built alternative infrastructure, and watched the economic pain flow back across the border. The country that was supposed to crack held. The country that applied the pressure paid for it. This stat is never discussed in those terms because it destroys the central narrative. That economic coercion against a smaller partner eventually produces submission. In this case, it produced the opposite, and no one in the mainstream press wants to explain why. To understand how the call happened, you need to understand what forced it. For weeks, the pressure on the White House had been building from every direction simultaneously, and crucially, from inside, not outside. The heads of major American manufacturing companies were sending increasingly desperate private communications. Supply chains that depended on Canadian inputs were dissolving. Energy companies facing supply disruptions were hemorrhaging money. Financial institutions managing the fallout of banking-related threats were running out of runway. More than 160 chief executives signed a letter calling for immediate leader-to-leader engagement. The letter leaked, almost certainly on purpose. Its message was surgical. Every week without resolution costs American jobs, destabilizes American markets, and weakens American credibility. The signatories weren't asking for Canadian concessions. They were telling the administration it was losing. 12 Republican senators sent a private letter. Respectful in tone, devastating in implication, continued support for the standoff was no longer sustainable without clear progress. The political translation was unambiguous. Produce results or lose the caucus. Then came the Allies. The British Prime Minister called directly. France's president made a similar appeal. Japan communicated through diplomatic channels that the international community would view direct dialogue as a minimum threshold of responsible governance. The walls closed in, not from Canada, not from the opposition, from America's own business establishment, America's own party, America's own partners. The call was arranged over the course of a week through back-channel diplomatic staff. Both sides agreed to ground rules. It would be substantive, not ceremonial. Senior advisors on both sides would be present. Both sides would prepare proposals. This was designed to be a negotiation. One side spent 4 days building a comprehensive framework. The other prepared talking points. That gap, a detailed proposal versus a set of bullet points, was the first signal of what was coming. Imagine you're a landlord. Your most important tenant is also your main source of income, your electricity supplier, and the person who holds the mortgage on the building. One day you decide to raise the rent dramatically, restrict access to utilities, and threaten to change the locks. You believe this will force them to renegotiate on your terms? Instead, they find another electricity supplier. They find a new investor for the mortgage. They stop buying the services you were selling them on the side, and they sit very quietly and wait. After 6 months, you're losing more money than they are. You've burned through your reserves. Your other tenants are asking questions. Your bank is getting nervous. You finally agree to sit down and talk. You walk in expecting them to beg. They walk in with a spreadsheet. That's not a tenant negotiation. That's the Canada-US confrontation of 2025, and the person who walks in with the spreadsheet doesn't need to raise their voice. The numbers do it for them. Most analysts describe what happened as a breakdown in diplomatic chemistry. Two leaders with incompatible styles who failed to connect. That explanation is wrong, and it's wrong in a way that matters. The real issue isn't style, it's structural. The confrontation was built on an assumption that proved false, that Canada's dependence on American markets was a lever of coercion. What the data showed, and what the Canadian side presented clearly, was that this dependence had been substantially reduced while the pressure was being applied. Canada had done the work. The threat had already been absorbed, which means the United States walked into the negotiation without its primary leverage point intact. That's not a communication problem. That's a strategic miscalculation of the first order. Go deeper and you find the second layer. Even if the administration had wanted to reverse course, the public framing of the confrontation as a test of American strength had made a quiet climb down nearly impossible. Any compromise would have been read domestically as retreat. So the incentive structure inside the White House pushed against resolution, even as the economic data screamed for it. And here's the game theory dimension that makes the challenger's behavior entirely rational. When you know the dominant power is trapped between economic reality and political optics, you don't need to escalate. You just need to wait. Patience is the strategy. Calm is the weapon. Picture a boardroom somewhere in Ottawa, floor-to-ceiling windows, gray light, a table covered in documents, each page dense with figures. The finance minister looks at the trade negotiator. They've been building this framework for 4 days. Every clause has been stress tested. Every number has 3 sources. The face-saving language for the other side has been drafted with particular care, the kind of care you extend to someone who needs to be able to tell their own people they won. The negotiator says quietly, "This is as reasonable as we can make it while still meaning something." The finance minister nods once. Then we present it and we see what kind of room we're actually in. That's not optimism. That's professional patience. And it's the most powerful thing you can bring to a table where the other side has nothing left but volume. Now picture the Oval Office. The call is about to begin. The room is full. Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, Trade Representative, Chief of Staff, 2 note takers. This is visibly a serious occasion. For the first 2 minutes, everything follows the expected choreography. Pleasantries. Formal acknowledgement of the gravity of the situation. The language of heads of state. Then the Canadian side begins presenting its framework, not opinion. Data, the cost to the American economy by sector, automotive, energy, agriculture, financial services. The numbers are sourced, attributed, delivered with the measured precision of a central bank presentation. Then the pivot to terms, phased, bilateral, structured to give the American side credit for the resolution. A framework that would have allowed the administration to tell its own public, "We negotiated a strong deal. We delivered." Approximately 9 minutes in, the temperature changes. Not because the terms are unreasonable, because they are reasonable, and because the calm, documented presentation is making clear to everyone in the room that one side came prepared and the other did not. The Canadian Prime Minister delivers a single passage, direct, factual, surgical. He notes that the confrontation has been more costly for the United States than for Canada. He notes that Canada has adjusted. He notes that the United States has not made equivalent adjustments. He says, "I believe you know this. I believe that is why we are on this call." Silence, and then something breaks. The shouting lasts roughly 30 seconds. No counter-argument, no data, no substantive disagreement, just volume. And then a sharp crash. The sound of a phone meeting a desk with force, and then dead air in Ottawa. The finance minister closes her eyes. The foreign affairs minister shakes her head once. The prime minister sits very still for a few seconds. Then quietly, "Well, that's unfortunate." Not anger, not satisfaction. The tone of a doctor whose patient has just rejected the diagnosis and who had suspected privately that this was always how it would end. In the Oval Office, nobody moves for what staff later describe as 10 to 15 seconds. Then one senior advisor says, "That's going to leak." Another, "We had nothing to say back. He had a proposal. We had nothing." The chief of staff leaves the room to call the communications team. The first instinct is not to repair the diplomacy. It is to repair the story. 3 drafts circulate in the first hour. The first frames the hang-up as the president refusing to be lectured. Killed immediately, Calling Canada a junior partner while Canada controls energy and banking leverage the United States cannot replace is, as one staffer reportedly says, bringing a slogan to a data fight. The second attempts to characterize the Canadian Prime Minister's tone as condescending. Killed because the Canadian side was on the same call and their account would contradict it within the hour. The third says only that the two leaders had a frank and direct conversation and that the president made clear the United States expects constructive engagement. It says nothing, and saying nothing confirms everything. The press conference comes 2 hours later. No theatrical backdrop, no flanking ministers. A man at a podium with a document. The restraint is the message. He does not mention the hang-up. He does not describe what happened. He says the call ended before the full presentation of the framework was completed. He would like to share what Canada proposed so that the public, the markets, and international partners can evaluate it themselves. Then he reads the terms, every clause. Phased, bilateral, structured for mutual benefit. A trade framework that restored access for both nations. Diplomatic restoration terms that allowed the United States to move at its own pace. Energy cooperation framed as a new agreement rather than a retreat. A sovereignty recognition clause worded as mutual affirmation. He finishes, looks up. These terms remain on the table. Canada is ready to resolve this when the United States is ready to continue the conversation. A reporter asks how the call ended. He pauses. Not for effect, reflectively. The pause of someone who understands that what they say next will be quoted for years. The call ended abruptly. I will leave it to the United States to characterize why. Another pause. We came to the table. He left it. He takes no further questions. 10 minutes. The most efficient demolition of a superpower's negotiating position in the modern diplomatic record, achieved with data, composure, and 7 words. One of the most respected investors in the history of American capitalism once observed that in 70 years of deal-making, one pattern has held without a single exception. The person with genuine leverage never raises their voice. They don't need to. The math is on their side. Time is on their side. They can sit quietly, lay out their position, and wait for the other party to understand what they already know. Calm in that framework is not a personality trait. It is a signal. It says, I know how this ends, and I'm comfortable waiting for you to figure that out. The inverse is equally precise. When someone raises their voice, slams a surface, storms out of a room, that is also a signal. It says, I have no response. I have no counter-argument. I have no data that challenges what I just heard. So I will make noise instead. Volume is what happens when the arguments run out. On a recorded call with senior staff present on both sides, the most powerful person in the world ran out of arguments at the 9-minute mark. And what the world heard in the silence that followed was not strength. It was its absence. Consider what the Allies heard. The British Prime Minister, who had personally pushed for the call, was briefed within the hour. The reaction, according to a diplomatic source, was despair. Not anger, despair. The specific despair of someone who advocated for a process and then watched it confirm their worst fear about the person they were advocating for. France, Japan, Germany. Each responded through carefully measured diplomatic language that translated in every capital to the same sentence. We no longer know if this partner can be engaged when it matters. Consider what the adversaries heard. A leader who cannot tolerate being presented with uncomfortable data by an ally is a leader whose reactions can be predicted and engineered. Flatter him and he opens doors. Present him with data that implies he is losing and he closes them. The psychological profile was made public not by espionage, not by a leak, but by a phone call with Canada. Every intelligence service that needed to understand how to manage the American president just received the clearest possible answer. Free of charge. Broadcast globally, here is where we stand. The call that was supposed to end the crisis lasted 14 minutes. It ended not with a counter-proposal, not with a request for time, not with a commitment to reconvene. It ended with a crash and dead air. One side came with a plan designed to give the other side a win. The other side came with a posture. When the plan proved stronger than the posture broke. The markets understood. They responded not to a policy change. No new tariffs were announced, no orders were signed, but to a character revelation. And here's the crucial distinction. Policies can be revised, strategies can be adjusted, orders can be revoked. Temperament cannot be legislated into existence. The inability to sit through a difficult conversation, to absorb data that contradicts your assumptions, to remain composed when the numbers are not in your favor, that is not a problem that gets corrected by the next news cycle. It is a constraint that shapes every interaction, every negotiation, every diplomatic moment that remains. And here is the number I have kept for the end. 14, not 420 billion, not 12 Republican senators, not 160 CEOs, 14 minutes. That is how long the leader of the free world lasted before the data became intolerable. 14 minutes, less time than it takes to board a commercial flight, less time than most corporate meetings run before anyone has said anything of substance. The 21st century will not be won by the country with the loudest voice. It will be won by the country that can sit in the room the longest with the clearest data and the patience to wait. Canada is still in that room. The terms are still on the table. The math has not changed. And math, unlike the President of the United States, does not hang up. So here's the question I want to leave you with. In a world where power is measured not by volume but by composure, not by force but by the ability to absorb pressure and weight, which leaders are actually winning? And which ones right now only look like they are? The call has ended. The silence continues. And somewhere in Ottawa, a document is still sitting on a table waiting to be read.